In July of 1918, the newly formed Soviet government made a stunning announcement. They declared to the world that Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, had been executed. But when the world asked about his wife, the Tsarina, and their 5 children, the official response was silence. They were, the state claimed, safe in a secure location. This wasn't a simple case of battlefield confusion. This was the calculated beginning of a 70-year-long lie. We all know the story of Anastasia's tragic murder, but the real darker mystery is why. Why did the most powerful and secretive state of the 20th century feel the need to pretend she was still alive? What truth were they so utterly terrified of? When most of us hear the name Anastasia, we don't picture a brutal execution. Our minds go somewhere else entirely. We picture a lost princess, a haunting melody from a music box, a desperate escape from a crumbling palace. We imagine a grand duchess, spirited away in the night, destined for a tearful reunion in Paris. This image, powerfully cemented in our minds by animated films and romantic legends, has become a modern fairy tale. It is a story of survival against all odds, a story of hope flickering in the darkness of a violent revolution. We cling to it because it feels like it should be true. But this powerful fantasy didn't start in a Hollywood studio. Its origins lie in a deliberate, state-sponsored void of information. In the years following the Russian Revolution, the story of the family's survival was not just a baseless rumor. It was a plausible theory, given fuel by the deafening silence from the Kremlin. The world was left to wonder, to hope, and to speculate. And in that fertile ground of uncertainty, the myth of the lost princess took root and grew into a global obsession, a mystery that captivated millions for the better part of a century. But while the world was dreaming of a lost princess, the architects of that dream knew the horrifying truth. They knew the real story had nothing to do with escape. Instead, it was a story of a chaotic, botched execution in a cramped, dark basement. A story of jewels sewn into corsets that horrifyingly deflected the first volley of bullets, turning a swift execution into a savage, prolonged massacre with bayonets. It was a story of a gruesome 2-day effort to completely destroy the evidence with gallons of acid and fire in a remote, muddy forest. This is the gruesome reality the fairy tale was designed to hide. So how did a lie of this magnitude even begin? To understand how that lie survived for decades, we first have to uncover why it was created in the first place. And buried within that reason is the very clue that will eventually lead us to a secret confession. A document that blows the entire conspiracy wide open. The lie began with 3 immediate and desperate calculations, each one designed to solve a different, existential threat to the new regime. The first and most immediate reason for the lie didn't concern the Russian people at all. It was entirely about Germany. The Tsarina Alexandra was not Russian by birth. She was German. More than that, she was the first cousin of one of the most powerful men in the world at the time, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. This familial connection, in the summer of 1918, was a profound and dangerous liability for the new Bolshevik government. Just a few months earlier, Lenin's regime had signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. It was a deeply humiliating peace treaty designed to pull Russia out of the First World War. In doing so, they had ceded vast territories and resources to Germany. The Bolshevik grip on power was incredibly fragile. Their Red Army was locked in a brutal civil war, and they could not afford to give Germany any reason to break the treaty and resume hostilities. A renewed German invasion would have meant the absolute end of their revolution. Admitting to the murder of German royalty, especially a mother and her children, would have been a catastrophic diplomatic insult. It was an act of barbarism that could have easily been spun by German war hawks as a justification to attack. The new Soviet state was simply too weak to take that risk. So they created a fiction. They announced the Tsar's death, a political act they could justify, but claimed his German-born wife and her children were safe. It was a calculated deception, a lie of pure political and diplomatic survival. It was their first line of defense against a world that was far from accepting their new and violent hold on power. Beyond the immediate threat from Germany, The Bolsheviks faced a much deeper, more ideological problem: the immense power of symbolism. In the calculus of revolution, executing the Tsar was a justifiable, even necessary act. Nicholas II was the bloody tyrant, the symbol of centuries of autocratic oppression. His death could be framed as the will of the people, the final decisive blow against a corrupt and broken system. It was an execution, but the public slaughter of his 5 children was something else entirely. Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the young sickly heir, Alexei. Their deaths could not be so easily justified. This could no longer be called a political necessity. It was a massacre. The Bolsheviks, who were masters of propaganda, understood this distinction perfectly. They knew that killing the children risked transforming the Romanovs from despised tyrants into something far more dangerous: holy martyrs. The image of the innocent children, slaughtered in a basement, could become an icon of Bolshevik brutality. It was a symbolic threat so profound that 60 years later, it would drive them to physically demolish the very house where the murders took place, just to erase the memory. This was a risk they could not afford to take, especially not in the midst of the raging Russian Civil War. A story of martyred children would have been a powerful recruiting tool for the anti-Bolshevik White Army. It would have become a rallying cry, a sacred banner for their cause. Let the subscribe button be the banner we now raise for the truth. They would have been fighting not just for the restoration of the old order, but for the memory of the innocent victims. By keeping the family's fate ambiguous, by allowing rumors of their survival to circulate, the Soviets cleverly neutralized this symbolic threat. A missing family can't be martyred, and a mystery, however compelling, is not a cause to die for. The third reason for the lie was far less strategic and much more practical. Its origins weren't in cunning, but in pure chaos and incompetence. The execution itself, as we know from later accounts, was a complete disaster. And this incompetence would directly lead to the very first investigation that threatened to expose the entire lie just days after it began. The secret report from the lead executioner, Yakov Yurovsky, paints a chilling picture. The execution squad, fueled by vodka, was unprepared for the reality of their task. When they opened fire in the small cellar, their bullets ricocheted off the corsets of the Grand Duchesses. Sewn into their undergarments were over 18 pounds of diamonds and jewels, which acted as a crude, but surprisingly effective, form of body armor. The initial volley failed to kill them. What followed was a nightmarish scene of smoke, screams, and brutal close quarters, killing with bayonets and pistols. It was a savage, bloody, and deeply traumatizing event, even for the hardened killers. The cover-up that followed was just as chaotic. Yurovsky's plan to dispose of the 11 bodies in a deep mine shaft went horribly wrong. The truck carrying the corpses got stuck in the thick mud of a forest road. As dawn approached, with the anti-Bolshevik White Army closing in on the city of Ekaterinburg, the execution squad panicked. They abandoned their original plan and hastily dug a shallow grave directly under the muddy road, hoping it would never be found. They doused the bodies in sulfuric acid to disfigure them, and in a final, desperate act, they took 2 of the smallest bodies, those of the heir, Alexei, and one of his sisters, to a separate location a short distance away where they attempted to completely destroy them on a bonfire before burying the charred remains. This messy, improvised disposal meant the Bolsheviks had no definitive proof of death that they could present to the public. Announcing the full story would have invited immediate investigation, and they couldn't risk the half-destroyed bodies being discovered by the advancing White Army. Such a discovery would have exposed their brutality, their incompetence, and provided their enemies with powerful physical relics. The lie was a practical necessity. It was a desperate curtain pulled over a scene of utter chaos, designed to hide a crime they had failed to properly conceal. But how do you keep a secret that's buried in the ground? Sooner or later, someone is bound to start digging, right? And as we're about to see, it only took a matter of days for the first truth seeker to arrive and begin uncovering them. The first crack in the Soviet wall of silence came just days after the murder. When the White Army captured the city of Ekaterinburg, they immediately launched an investigation. The man they chose to lead it was a meticulous and obsessive investigator named Nikolai Sokolov. He arrived at the Ipatiev house, the House of Special Purpose, and immediately knew he was standing in a slaughterhouse. The cellar walls were riddled with bullet holes and scored by bayonets, a clear testament to a brutal struggle. Sokolov's real work, however, began in the Koptyaki forest, at the site of the abandoned mineshaft known as Ganina Yama. For months, he and his team sifted through the cold, damp earth, painstakingly cataloging everything they found. The forest itself seemed to be telling the story the Soviets were trying to suppress. Sokolov discovered the remnants of massive bonfires. In the ashes, he found corset stays, shoe buckles, and a collection of precious gems that had fallen from the victim's clothing. Most chillingly, he found fragments of scorched human bone, a finger belonging to the Tsarina's doctor, and the corpse of Anastasia's small dog, Jemmy, at the bottom of the mineshaft. Sokolov correctly concluded that the entire family and their retinue had been murdered, and that a desperate attempt had been made to destroy their bodies with fire. He published his findings after fleeing Russia, providing the world with the first concrete evidence of the massacre. But he never found the primary grave. This crucial missing piece allowed the Soviet propaganda machine to go on the offensive. For the next 70 years, they systematically discredited his work, branding the entire meticulous investigation as a piece of bourgeois propaganda and an elaborate fabrication designed to slander the revolution. The first person to uncover the truth was silenced by the power of the state lie. The official Soviet denial had a strange and powerful side effect. By creating a vacuum of information, it gave birth to a global phenomenon: the Anastasia imposters. The ambiguity surrounding the family's death created a space for fantasy and opportunism to flourish. Over the decades, dozens of individuals from around the world emerged, each claiming to be one of the lost Romanov children who had miraculously escaped the massacre. The most famous, of course, was Anna Anderson, a woman who maintained for over 50 years that she was the Grand Duchess Anastasia. From the Kremlin's perspective, this was an unintended but incredibly useful development. The Soviets quietly observed as the world became fixated on the drama of the imposters. The debate over Anna Anderson's identity raged for decades, involving court cases, handwriting analysis, and earlobe comparisons. This circus of speculation served the Soviet purpose perfectly. It shifted the world's focus. The central question was no longer, did the Soviet state murder a family in cold blood? Instead, it became, is this one woman the real Anastasia? The imposter phenomenon turned a brutal political crime into a romantic mystery, a decades-long soap opera. It was the perfect distraction, an unintentional but highly effective tool in the ongoing cover-up. But what if I told you there was a document, a secret confession, that proves the Soviets knew the absolute truth all along? Because while the Soviets projected a story of ambiguity to the world, internally, the truth was known from the very beginning. And this is the linchpin of the entire conspiracy. The proof lies in a secret document, a confidential report written in 1920 by the lead executioner himself, Yakov Yurovsky. This document, intended only for the highest levels of the Bolshevik Party, was never meant to see the light of day. This wasn't meant as propaganda for the public. It was a cold, detailed, step-by-step account of the murder and the subsequent disposal of the bodies. It was, for all intents and purposes, a confession. In chillingly bureaucratic language, the Yurovsky note describes everything. It details the botched initial shooting and the shocking discovery of the jewels in the girl's clothing. It recounts the brutal work with the bayonets. It describes the loading of the 11 bodies onto the truck, the failed journey to the distant mines, and the panicked late-night decision to dig a shallow grave in the middle of the road. Most importantly, it explicitly states that 2 bodies, those of the Tsarevich Alexei and one of his sisters, were taken to a separate location to be burned. The note contained the exact location of the graves and the precise details of the crime. This document remained buried deep within the Soviet archives for over half a century. Its existence proves that while the official state policy was one of denial and obfuscation, the highest echelons of the Communist Party knew the exact gruesome truth all along. They knew where the bodies were buried. They knew how they had died. So while the world saw the mystery of Anastasia, to them it was no mystery at all. It was simply a secret they were actively and consciously keeping. As the decades passed, the lie was maintained, but the physical evidence of the crime remained. The Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg, the site of the murders, had become a problem. Despite being repurposed for various state offices, it had become an unofficial and unwelcome shrine. People, both foreign tourists and quiet Russian monarchists, would come to stare at the building, leaving flowers or prayers. It was a silent, architectural witness to the crime the state continued to deny. By the 1970s, the Soviet leadership decided this silent witness needed to be permanently silenced. In 1977, on the direct recommendation of the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, who would later become the leader of the Soviet Union, the Politburo issued a secret resolution. The Ipatiev house was to be demolished immediately. The official reason given to the public was the need for urban redevelopment. But the timing, just ahead of the 60th anniversary of the murders, was no coincidence. It was a calculated act of historical vandalism, a final, desperate attempt to erase the crime scene itself. If the house no longer existed, the story might finally fade. They were cementing the denial in rubble and dust, but you can't demolish a secret that's written down on paper. In the very same decade that the Ipatiev house was being destroyed, two local Russians, an amateur geologist named Alexander Avdonin and a filmmaker named Gely Ryabov, began a secret investigation of their own. They had managed to get access to a copy of the hidden Yurovsky note, and they used its detailed descriptions as a treasure map. For years, they secretly explored the Koptyaki forest, using the executioner's own words to guide them. Finally, in 1979, they found it. Probing the ground in an area of sunken earth along an old cart track, they hit something. They dug down and uncovered several skulls and bones. They knew immediately they had found the Romanovs. But this was still the Soviet Union, a state ruled by the same KGB that had ordered the demolition of the Ipatiev house. Revealing their discovery would have been incredibly dangerous. It could have meant prison, or worse. The power and the terror of the official Soviet denial were still very real. So, in a decision that speaks volumes about the climate of fear, they reburied the remains, swore an oath of secrecy, and waited for a day when the truth could finally be told. That day came in 1991, with the stunning collapse of the Soviet Union. As the old regime crumbled, Avdonin and Ryabov finally revealed their secret. A new official Russian investigation was launched, and the main grave was formally exhumed. Inside, they found the jumbled, acid-damaged remains of 9 bodies. The scientific challenge was immense. To prove their identities beyond any doubt, investigators turned to the new, revolutionary technology of DNA analysis. It was science that would ultimately destroy the myth. International teams of forensic experts were brought in. They extracted DNA from the bones and compared it to samples provided by living Romanov relatives, most famously Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, whose maternal grandmother was a sister of the Tsarina Alexandra. The results were conclusive. The DNA matched perfectly. The grave contained the remains of the Tsar, the Tsarina, their doctor, their servants, and 3 of their daughters. Science had confirmed what the Soviets had denied for 73 years. But 2 bodies were still missing, Alexei and one of his sisters, just as the Yurovsky note had claimed. For years, this final piece of the puzzle fueled a last flicker of the survival myth. That was extinguished in the summer of 2007. Guided once again by Yurovsky's confession, archaeologists found a second, smaller grave not far from the first. It contained 44 charred bone fragments. After years of painstaking DNA analysis, scientists confirmed that these were the remains of the Tsarevich Alexei and his sister, Grand Duchess Maria. The entire family was accounted for. The 90-year-old lie, and the romantic myth it had spawned, were finally and irrevocably destroyed by the cold, hard light of science. The story of Anastasia shows how a state-sponsored lie can hide a tragic reality. But what happens when the tragic reality is hidden not by a state, but by the author himself? The story of the ugly duckling isn't about a swan. It's the secret, heartbreaking autobiography of Hans Christian Andersen.